So yeah, I'm an anti-nuclear campaigner. I'm based in Glasgow, but I'm from Edinburgh, so it's actually really nice to come and do this today. I really rarely get through to Edinburgh to do stuff like this. So as I said, I spent a couple of years sort of living and campaigning against nuclear weapons at the Peace Camp out at Faz Lane, and I then went on to work and sort of progress campaigns with Scottish CND, Peace Education Scotland, Secure Scotland. And I'm currently working with a wee anti-capitalist collective in Glasgow, exploring kind of radical municipalism and alternative democratic futures for the city. But I'm really pleased to get the chance to speak today on kind of weapons, power, and the power of workers. I'm sure 90% of the people in this room are going to be very familiar with the story I'm about to tell, but I'm going to tell it anyway, because, let's be honest, we don't often get a chance to tell nice stories in the anti-nuclear, anti-war community. We're quite a gloomy campaign, so we kind of clutch our successes tightly to our breast. So on the 11th of September 1973, General Pinochet embarked on his military coup in Chile, bombing the palace in Santiago with jet fighters and unleashing a campaign of horrific violence, torture and death against the citizens and workers there. Now at that time there was only one place on earth where the workers were equipped and qualified to repair and maintain the engines for the Chilean Air Force jets, and that was in a wee town in the middle of nowhere in some kind of tiny country in the middle of the sea called Scotland. So crates containing the Chilean jet engines arrived at the Rolls-Royce factory in East Kilbride in March of 1974. What the Chilean Air Force had not anticipated was that these crates would be checked by Bob Fulton. Now, Bob Fulton was a union man, and Bob Fulton's union had already passed a motion condemning the situation in Chile, and so Fulton and the rest of the workers on the floor quickly decided that no work could or should be done to repair and maintain the engines or even remove them from the crates. In fact, probably the best course of action, just dump them outside, wouldn't it? Dump them outside in the rain and let them rust. And soon over 4,000 Rolls-Royce workers had come together and voted to stand in solidarity with the Chilean people. And within a year of being left outside in this lovely Scottish weather we have, the engines were absolutely fucking useless. The fury that came not obviously just from the Chilean military but from the Tories here at home was immense. We now know that for a time the entire Chilean Air Force kind of operations had to be grounded because they didn't have a single plane capable of action. So the pressure to yield was absolutely immense. But one thing that General Pinochet and his comrades had failed to take into account during this time was the resolute stubbornness of Scottish people and the power of workers taking this collective action. And so those crates sat in the Rolls-Royce yard for 4 years and have never been returned to Chile. So hats off to Scottish workers and workers around the world. But today, being May 7th, is also an important day for the anti-nuclear campaign, as this day in 1945 marked the first rehearsals of the so-called Trinity Tests, which were carried out by the US government in the state of New Mexico. And these were early tests of weapons-grade plutonium, and these tests were kind of quickly refined and evolved into the weapons that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki later that year. This test produced a blast equivalent to 10,000 tons of TNT and was felt by civilians over 100 miles away. The fallout resulted in the irradiation of cattle, increased cancers among the neighbouring populations, and contaminated water supplies, which were feeding into industrial production of paper and scattering that radiation nationwide. Now at the time, the US military put out a statement to the surrounding public describing the blast as a heavy explosion. And in the case of the contaminated river, this was kept secret for almost 4 years. And I think this kind of utter disregard for the lives and the livelihoods of their own nation's workers and families is really at the core, not just of what war is all about, but of hyper-capitalism, of austerity, and every other profitable oppression that we've seen from our leading class throughout history. And the awakening of the citizen and the worker to acknowledge that trauma and to respond to that trauma and to these intersections is really at the core of kind of why we're all here today, really. Whatever flavour of human suffering you happen to be campaigning on today, there's a place within that to present a challenge on nuclear weapons, because they have a global life cycle that touches so many other issues, so many people's lives, before we even think about the point of a nuclear detonation or a nuclear explosion. If you campaign for justice for Indigenous communities, let's talk about the impact and legacy of nuclear tests, uranium mining, throughout both the military and civilian nuclear industries today. If you're campaigning for women's rights, we can talk about the fact that nuclear weapons are the ultimate symbol of the concept of security as designed and defined by patriarchal systems, not to mention the increased harm to the bodies of women compared to the fact that the measurements of radiation are judged against the bodies of a healthy male. If you're campaigning for Scottish independence or the progress of democracy in general, let's talk about the fact that in this country, nuclear weapons are housed in a nation that has repeatedly used a democratic process to oppose them, and the well-being of the people here is just deemed an acceptable collateral damage for us having them. The flip side of that being that we may be the only nation on earth who is capable of disarming a nuclear-armed state from within, and I think that's pretty badass. If you campaign for environmental rights, let's talk about nuclear pollution, the contamination of water systems and agriculture, the dumping of nuclear runoff and nuclear waste. If you campaign on food poverty, we can talk about the threat of a nuclear winter to destroy crop production and upset global food distribution across the world, plunging tens of millions into starvation. If you campaign against capitalism, let's face it, nuclear weapons are incredibly expensive to produce and maintain. Many public funds in banks and pension schemes are invested in these industries without consultation or consent of the public. That money goes straight into the hands of arms companies, and I don't have to tell you what else we could use that money for. If you campaign for public safety, let's talk about how in this country the warheads are being convoyed up and down the country on public roads several times a year, and police simulations of accidents always end in utter disaster because no agency wants to take full responsibility for the safety of that convoy. If you campaign on healthcare, the diseases that are associated with being exposed to these types of weapons terrorize the bodies not only of those who were exposed, but also then span multiple generations afterwards. We have babies growing up in kind of our generation now, babies being born today, who are at higher risk of cancers or will have various types of cancers because of exposure from their great-great-great-great-grandparent in 1945. If you're an anti-fascist campaigner, let's face it, nuclear weapons are the attack dogs that are employed by nations to secure their space on the United Nations Security Council and intimidate other nations into submission to their military and corporate interests, and the hypocrisy with which these nations will then call to arms at the idea of any new countries gaining these weapons. If you campaign against conventional weapons, we know that missiles tipped with depleted uranium have been used by our military in the war in Iraq, just to name one, and while this may not emanate a nuclear explosion, the harmful effects of the radiation can still be seen in victims. If you campaign on climate change, let's think about the fact that countries with nuclear operations have ensured that clauses are included in the UN climate negotiations so that military operations have been including the nuclear weapons industry, have been consistently left out with the figures for global emissions, even though we know that they make up at least 5%. From a trade union perspective, in this country, let's think about the fact that the livelihoods of the workers working at Faslane are constantly used to justify the fact that we have these horrible threats to all of our existence, when we know that those skills can and should and have been diversified to make systems that actually help keep people alive. And of course, we need to talk about deterrence. UK policy states that we will not rule out using Trident as a preemptive first strike, but certainly on a public level, the UK and the other nuclear-armed states refer to their nuclear arsenals as deterrence, right? So linguistically based on the premise that it won't be used, but that its performative power will intimidate and warn off others. And the fallacies and hypocrisies that are contained within that logic are numerous. But this year it became even more stark and apparent how that policy can be weaponized to bring countries to their knees. Nuclear deterrence makes nuclear use far more likely, because in order for deterrence to work, the threat for use must feel credible. And so particularly in times of conflict, nuclear-armed states are always poised to launch. The nuclear threat has been used to severely limit the capacity of states across the world to respond to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Leaders of the world have put us in a position where people like Putin can essentially behave with impunity, threatening nuclear war if there's an intervention in their murder and torture of civilians. With nuclear arsenals acting as the guard dogs, nuclear states can wreak havoc within their own countries and on others. Deterrence policy essentially means that we're constantly witnessing a game of chess in which each opponent is trying to convince the other of their greater capacity and willpower for mass destruction, each one threatening to set in motion a course of events that could potentially lead to our extinction. And with the fate of the planet hanging in the balance, the rest of the world is just expected to accept this behaviour as a necessary condition to us having a planet on which to enact these twisted games. It's an impossible choice with no positive outcomes. Defenders of nuclear weapons will argue that deterrence policy keeps the peace. Never let that go unchallenged. These policies are violent, These policies kill people every day, and these policies are directly facilitating the slaughter of the Ukrainian people today. Now is the time to push for global disarmament. Now is the time to get involved with your local CND group. Now is the time when never again really needs to mean something. So I'd like to finish, if I've got time, with a few verses from a poem that I wrote for the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing last year. How lucky we are for our rain to bring life, for every chance taken on meeting a stranger, to boast of our tap water from Thurso to Fife, to never know it to bring danger. To preach glory, teach empire, and ingrain in the gut that blood must always be thicker than water, but rain can be black and thicker than blood, the rain that came after we sanctioned the slaughter. Our rain grows heather hillsides and hand-fast carnations, ice skating on locks when it freezes. Black rain brings orphans, making graveside libations with a Molotov cocktail of deathly diseases. Solidarity with victims, both living and lost. Our system is broken, but you give us strength to disrupt it. Peace is a line that should never be crossed. Nuclear warfare is hell made public. Anti-nuclear family, my peaceful people's pantheon. We carry no swords nor desire to unsheath them, but with arms outstretched, our umbrellas are drawn, and we will shelter your stories beneath them. We live in a world where wars wage for profits, and our efforts can feel like a drop in the ocean. But what are the seas, if not collectives of droplets, raised up by cruel winds and united in motion? What's a minute of silence to 76 years of torment? What's a fast or a placard to a storm of black rain? Whoever, wherever you are in this moment, it's never too late to pledge never again.